This move, the queen's pawn game, immediately stakes a claim in the center, opening diagonals for the queen and bishop, and preparing for pawn advances that can control key squares. This move initiates one of the most flexible and popular responses to 1d4, preparing to develop the kingside pieces and maintain control over central squares while keeping options open for various defensive systems. This move establishes control over the center and prepares for the development of white's queenside pieces, aiming for a strong pawn structure that can support central pawn advances later in the game. This move initiates a Queen's Indian defense or Nimzo Indian defense setup, preparing to develop the king's bishop and control the central light squares. This move prepares to control the center and develop another piece, often leading to a Queen's Indian defense or Nimzo Indian defense setup depending on black's next moves. This move firmly establishes the queen's gambit declined, a solid and theoretically rich opening, allowing black to challenge white's central pawn control and aim for harmonious development. This move, by pinning black's knight to the queen, disrupts black's fundamental pawn structure in the queen's gambit declined and challenges the integrity of their central control. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing to castle and defend the e6 pawn while anticipating white's potential central pawn push. This move reinforces the center and prepares to develop the kingside bishop, solidifying the pawn structure against black's potential central breaks. This move immediately challenges white's bishop on g5, aiming to disrupt the established pawn structure and potentially create a weakness on white's kingside. This move continues the Queen's Indian defense, maintaining tension and indirectly challenging black's pawn structure by preparing to double pawns. If black recaptures on h4, castling kingside solidifies the king's safety and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard defensive maneuver in this queen's gambit declined structure. This move initiates a flexible plan to support the c-pawn advance and control the important c-file, preparing for central pawn breaks or queenside expansion. This move prepares to fianchetto the queenside bishop, often a strategic goal in queen's gambit declined variations to create diagonal pressure against white's central pawn structure. This captures the central pawn, opening the c-file and allowing white to develop the queen towards the center while potentially aiming to pressure black's queenside development. This recapture reinforces black's central pawn presence and prepares to develop the queen's bishop from c8 to either e6 or d7. This recapture opens the d-file, creating an immediate opportunity for active piece play and potential pressure on black's central pawns. This recapture opens the e-file for black's rook, establishing a more active position and preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure. This exchange clears the central pawn structure, opening the diagonal for white's queen and potentially creating an outpost on d5 if black recaptures with the knight. Black recaptures the pawn with the queen, centralizing it and preparing to contest the open c-file while avoiding pawn weaknesses. This move repositions the knight to a more flexible square, preparing to support a central pawn push or redeploy to a more active attacking or defensive position on the kingside. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the center and preparing to connect the rooks after castling. This knight maneuver aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting a central pawn push or attacking vulnerable squares around black's king. The move road 8 is a reasonable development, centralizing the rook and preparing to contest the d-file, a key open file that will likely become a battleground. This move aims to reroute the bishop to a more active square, likely on g4. to put pressure on black's kingside after white completes development and potentially prepares a kingside attack. This move initiates a central pawn break, aiming to challenge white's pawn center and open lines for black's pieces. This move castles the king to safety, consolidating white's position after black's dynamic pawn break and preparing to connect the rooks for future action. This move opens the c-file and immediately challenges white's central control, aiming to develop dynamic piece play in the resulting semi-open position. The capture of the pawn on d4 is a principled response that frees the queen and initiates a more active phase of the game, aiming to exploit white's slightly passive piece placement. This move, nc6, directly challenges white's dominant queen on d4 and prepares to support the central pawn structure. After potential exchanges, the queen repositions to a more active central square, eyeing potential weaknesses on the queenside and preparing to support pawn advances or piece activity in the center. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, directly challenging white's queen and potentially aiming to create exchanges or improve piece coordination. This move seeks to improve the bishop's position by placing it on a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's queenside and potentially create tactical opportunities along the c4-8 diagonal. This move activates the knight, challenging white's dominant queen and aiming to exchange pieces to ease black's cramped position, and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. This move addresses the immediate threat of the black knight on a5 to the b2 pawn, while simultaneously creating a safe square for the white king on h2 should central pawn tension lead to an attack. Black exchanges queens, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit the d-file and potential queenside activity in the ensuing endgame. Exchanging the bishop for the knight clarifies white's pawn structure and removes black's active piece, aiming for a slightly more comfortable endgame. The knight maneuvers to c4, creating an outpost and challenging white's queen while potentially preparing to support a central pawn push with e5. nd3 repositions the knight to a more active square on the kingside, aiming to support a potential kingside attack or control key central squares while keeping an eye on the vulnerable black pawn on d5. This move effectively brings the rook to the semi-open c-file, challenging white's control and preparing to exert pressure on the queenside. This move repositions the rook to the d-file, a natural central file that has been recently opened, to challenge black's control and potentially exploit it later. This move repositions the rook to the e-file, contesting control and preparing for potential exchanges or a later advance, while also supporting the pawn on e6. By repositioning the bishop to b3, white aims to increase pressure on black's queenside pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances or further piece maneuvering along the third rank. This move creates dynamic pawn tension on the queenside, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and challenge white's positional advantage on the open c-file.